So the latest is that the U.S. launched airstrikes on the Iranian coast. This is just in the middle of peace talks. These airstrikes were supposedly targeting Iranian military bases along the Strait of Hormuz near the city of Bandar Abbas. Not very productive for peace talks. Iran has yet to react, but I'm sure that there will be some kind of reaction. I am Borzu Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. You can find it at Substack at borzu.substack.com, or you can find it on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or YouTube. The U.S. military says it launched the airstrikes because Iran was doing something suspicious, either was planting mines or something like that. Some ships were destroyed, some Iranian ships of the Navy that the U.S. said it destroyed completely and utterly before. And apparently 4 Iranian personnel, military personnel, were killed in these attacks. I'm not sure what the thinking here is. At first, they said this was related to the safety of U.S. ships, but U.S. ships are not really close to the Strait of Hormuz right now. There is a suspicion that these whole peace talks are a farce, and that the U.S. is sort of dangling the prospect of sanctions relief and cash and a normalization of relations with Iran in an effort to lull the Iranians into being unprepared for an attack. And that attack, some have speculated, could begin in 6 days at the end of the Hajj, at the end of the pilgrimage, so that people are not stranded because of any kind of armed conflict in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, because of the Hajj. But if that were the case, why would the Americans launch this airstrike? Because this is going to put the Iranians on the highest of alerts. If anything, this airstrike is going to make the Iranians even more suspicious of the Americans. They're going to sabotage any kind of negotiations, but they're also going to sabotage any attempt at a sneak attack, any kind of surprise attack. Now the Iranians are basically suspecting that the Americans are not serious about peace, and they're just looking for new angles to attack the country. Last night, I had a great conversation with France 24 on a gamut of subjects with a bunch of people, and I'm going to include the link to the entire debate that we had on France 24 with the always excellent Francois Picard. I'm going to put it in the Substack in case you want to watch the whole thing. There was some great discussion that I will include clips of in the following segment about the peace talks, the possibility of peace and negotiations, also about the politics in the Persian Gulf right now, and the possibility that the United Arab Emirates could get more and more isolated, or maybe not so isolated. We talked about Israeli politics as well as U.S. politics, as well as the prospect that Iran might restore internet.
Security is important to us. Managing the Strait of Hormuz is our legal right.
Managing the Strait of Hormuz is our legal right. Borzu Dergahi, we heard the German Chancellor quip that the Iranians were very good at not negotiating. Is that what this is? Because we're hearing mixed messages from both sides.
The Iranians are good at driving a hard bargain. One of the things that they are going to demand is either some kind of financial compensation via imposing a toll, or perhaps more legally sound, an environmental tax on ships transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. And one of the reasons why Iran's central bank governor might be in Doha right now, along with Arakchi and the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf, is to discuss the frozen funds. There's not going to be any movement on any memorandum of understanding opening up of the strait without some kind of understanding, some kind of solid gesture of goodwill on the part of the Americans with regard to cold, hard cash. Now, as for negotiating styles, wow. If you just look at the timeline of what happened, Trump, for the first time on Friday, issued this very serious, very sober-minded Truth Social post talking about the Pakistanis and the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks negotiating this potential framework for a deal. It was unlike anything he had written in recent weeks. And then as soon as he put this out, just the neoconservatives and the warmongers and war hawks in Washington just went crazy on him. And you can see the lobbying lobbying effort going on. And then they imposed this, oh, but in order for this deal to come to fruition, you're going to have to sign on to the Abraham Accords. That's absurd. That's a non-starter, especially for Pakistan, which has zero relations with Israel and is probably more pro-Palestinian than Palestinians. So anyway, it looks like there was an effort. There is some serious diplomacy going on, but there's a lot of forces and factors gumming up the works, so to speak, and trying to prevent this deal to come to fruition for whatever purposes.
Some Gulf states calling in favors. We're talking about the United Arab Emirates, demanding the same country that demanded immediate repayment of a loan to peace facilitators Pakistan, also accepting the help of Egyptian Rafale jets, as seen when President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi visited his Emirati counterpart, Mohammed bin Zayed, earlier this month.
I think that Sisi is just being smart. I don't think he's going to actually commit troops to the protection of Abu Dhabi. This is a kind of signaling exercise meant to appease the UAE leadership. They're extremely isolated right now. They're isolated from the rest of the Gulf. They were basically pounded upon by Iran during the conflict. Iran basically has threatened to wipe the United Arab Emirates away if there is a further escalation of the conflict. That is because of the robust role that the United Arab Emirates played in assisting the U.S. and Israel during the attack. Iran basically sees the UAE as a Israeli outpost in the Gulf. And so it's feeling very vulnerable. On the other hand, it's also having huge problems with Saudi Arabia. It has permanent issues with Qatar that have yet to be fully resolved yet. And this was a little gesture of support for the United Arab Emirates from Egypt, from Sisi, meant to shore up probably reserves in Egypt's central bank. The United Arab Emirates is a big investor in the central bank and a big investor in Egypt in general. They need the cash. United Arab Emirates needs to look not quite so isolated.
All right, so money talks, but Borzu, when you compare, as you say, the UAE being isolated today from the rest of the Gulf region, how does that compare to Qatar a few years ago?
Oh, it's not as bad as that. I mean, Qatar was basically it was being besieged by those Gulf countries, by the United Arab Emirates. But I think that genuinely there was a regret on the part of Saudi Arabia for taking part in that. Genuinely, the UAE was serving as a kind of Iago character to MBS's Othello and seduced him into putting this conflict and this besiegement of Qatar during that time. And this is a different situation now. I think generally now MBS looks very, very, very suspiciously at the United Arab Emirates and keeps a distance.
Head of public relations at Iran's communications ministry that's made this announcement of the reopening of the internet. Is it about events taking place across in the negotiations? Or is it about domestic issues? Iran has a pain threshold, but that pain threshold, it reaches a point, doesn't it, when you look at, for instance, the inflation rate, which is soaring, Borzu?
Yeah, no, I think it's more about economy. The internet, as Payman was saying, the internet is a very important tool of commerce in the country. Iran has I had a great interview, if you want to look on my Substack, with a Tehran entrepreneur who has access to Zoom at his office. And we talked about the pressure that people are under because of the lack of internet. And, you know, he was saying he actually managed to write an op-ed in the reformist newspaper Sharq, and it was widely circulated, this article, saying that the regime was shooting itself in the foot for blocking the internet. It was an own goal, he called it. And he said, actually, rather than being arrested or criticized for writing this, he got a lot of good feedback from people. And so I think there has been this discussion, we should reopen the internet. And I think it's more than anything, if they do reopen the internet, which will probably happen and there's been momentum towards that for the last couple of weeks, it's just a show of confidence. it's a show of confidence in the stability of the regime, and probably a little gift to the people for being rather docile in recent weeks and not going out into the streets and protesting and so on. As Peyman was saying, there's been an atmosphere of fear as well. Daily protests also out on the streets in favor of the regime, pro-regime people, basically intimidating anyone who comes out to walk around at night, essentially waving the flag in people's faces and so on. And I think that this is a show of stability and confidence by opening up the internet again.
We saw last week with a contrarian Republican congressman, Thomas Massey, who was beaten in a primary, and there was a lot of money thrown at that race. Donald Trump wanted him out, but so did the pro-Israel lobby, because he'd been a critic of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge debate in the United States. Right now, it is sometimes getting toxic and sometimes veers into ugly anti-Semitism. But the bottom line is that most Americans right now believe that Israel has too much influence in U.S. foreign policy. More Americans than not are sympathetic with the Palestinian cause rather than the Israeli cause for the first time, maybe in U.S. history. And this is a seismic shift that's taking place. Israel is going to have to adjust. American politicians are going to have to adjust because, I mean, that's become like a litmus test for many American voters. Are you a pro-Israel shill or not? And if you are, then I don't care what your other policies are. I'm going to not vote for you. And that is becoming an increasingly dominant trend in the United States. There's also election year politics in Israel. As you pointed out, I think a lot of the criticisms of Netanyahu and the way he does things from his opponents have to be taken with a grain of salt. I don't think that there's that much air between the various prime ministerial frontrunners and Netanyahu in terms of their policies and how they would go about doing things. I think that there is on the issues of national security, Iran, Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon, a certain consensus in Israel, with one caveat. I think that any other Israeli government would be smart enough not to unleash Ben-Gvir and Smotrich on the West Bank, because that is proving to be a public relations disaster for Israel. Also, recently, I had a great conversation with Pakistan's News 24 with host and fellow Columbia Journalism School graduate Fahd Hassan, a deep dive into the nature of the ongoing negotiations, as well as what's happening in Washington and what's happening internally in Israel.
So now things are at a stage where there is cautious optimism. And both sides are saying that perhaps they are fairly close to a deal, but still so much could go wrong. So what are you hearing?
Well, yes, there are indications that there is some serious negotiation going on between the two sides. And it even appeared for a little while that Donald Trump was engaging in serious negotiations and serious communications, but that quickly dissipated as news of this possible deal spread through Washington. What some people call the blob got a hold of it, this network of just these hawkish analysts and former politicians and lobbyists. They got a hold of this news of a possible deal, and without even hearing the details of it, they just started pouncing, humiliating Donald Trump, calling him names and so on. And essentially, the network got into action, the lobby got into action, and they basically pushed him into a situation where he kind of backed off, and then the Iranians backed off a little bit. But it does still appear, despite this bluster, despite this rhetoric, that there is some kind of serious negotiation taking place, and there is a broad framework, at least for a temporary memorandum of understanding to be worked out. At least that is playing out for now.
I mean, what we are also reading is that the breakthrough or the agreement or the final announcement of an agreement may take a couple of days, but since the basic fundamentals have been worked out, and it is in the interest of both Iran and the US to actually go for it, so the chances of it actually happening perhaps outweigh those of another round of failed negotiation?
Look, it's really simple. Iran has made its conditions fairly obvious and fairly transparent. Iran has said that if the U.S. gives it a little bit of either sanctions relief or freezes some of its own assets that are being held up, they will open up the Strait of Hormuz, and then in turn the Trump administration will open up its blockade of Iranian ports inside the Persian Gulf, and that will create a space of trust for negotiation to continue. But it's the Trump administration that keeps changing the goalposts. They said that they would agree to this condition, and then hours later, Trump said, no, we're not going to do anything before there's a nuclear deal. We're not going to do anything on Lebanon, which was one of the preconditions that they would impose a ceasefire. Basically, if you look at the agreement that they appear to be talking about, it's actually going back to the original ceasefire deal that ended the kinetic portion of the war, neither of which has been adhered to. That deal was ceasefire in Lebanon, ceasefire in all theaters, and then we reopened the Straits of Hormuz. They're basically, if you think about it, that's basically what they're quibbling over right now, that original ceasefire deal. And that's so in a way, it looks like we've made some progress. It's calmed the markets a bit and so on. It's given some people some hope. But if you look at the actual things that have been agreed to, it's not that rosy of a picture.
I mean, one of the more encouraging signs was when President Trump had this conference call with the leaders of many Gulf countries and also and everybody, I think, essentially just argued that, this was the time to strike the best deal possible. So at that point, it seemed like, everything was all set. And perhaps it still is. It's just the optics that are sounding a bit, what's the right word to say? They're a bit cautious.
Yeah, and I should say, and I said it in my podcast yesterday, really Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, these countries, they deserve some kind of recognition. Maybe they deserve the Nobel Peace Prize that Trump has been coveting for so long, because they are really pushing this. They are trying to get on Trump's good side. They are maintaining good relations with Iran. They're communicating. You had the Pakistani leader, Munir, going back and forth between Islamabad and Tehran, beseeching the Iranians to take this deal. Some real hands-on diplomacy on the part of Pakistan and some of these other regional players, in contrast to Europe. But again, if you look at the actual facts that they're basically trying to hammer out at this point, it's just to get back to where we were when the war ended, which is what we wanted when the war ended, which is an open Strait of Hormuz, a removal of the blockade on Iranian ports, and a ceasefire in Lebanon, none of which we have right now, and none of which the Trump administration appears to be agreeing to.
Today the timing is also interesting, as you were mentioning. The Pakistani leadership is in Beijing today. Both the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and also Field Marshal Asim Munir, they've just had a meeting with President Xi Jinping also. So it's a bilateral visit, of course, but happening at this time with the Field Marshal flying straight from Tehran to Beijing to join the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, China doesn't want to be too much involved in this, at least visibly, because it's betting on failure. This is what I think. And it doesn't want to be associated with a failure, quite wisely. And it has a choice. Unlike, let's say, Pakistan or Turkey or Saudi Arabia, these neighboring countries, they don't have a choice. They have to get involved in this, because if this blows up, it blows up in their faces. China has massive oil reserves. China has other sources of energy. It has huge sovereign wealth and so on. So it could survive a further catastrophe in the Persian Gulf. But other countries can't. So China's keeping a little bit of distance, but it is very concerned, and it most definitely discussed the situation in the Persian Gulf with Pakistan.
If the deal does come through on the terms that we are talking about, what is the fear in Washington amongst the hawks? They think that as a result of this deal, Iran would come out stronger?
Yeah, I mean, but that's the bottom line. Look, the bottom line is the U.S. didn't accomplish any of its goals, and it was in many ways humiliated on the battlefield to a certain extent. It was checkmated. Its bases in the region are destroyed. But the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself, they don't want to acknowledge that they've suffered any kind of defeat. They keep describing this as this amazing, glowing victory. But the bottom line is that No, that's really not what it is. I'm not saying that Iran won the war, but the U.S. didn't win at all. It lost. It lost ground. It lost ground diplomatically. It lost ground reputationally. It lost ground militarily, even if you look at its depleted stockpiles. But it refuses to acknowledge that.
If the terms that we are talking about, very roughly, if they end up being part of the final deal and sanctions are lifted on Iran, some funds are which are free, are unfrozen, and the missile capability, Iran retains that. Relationship between countries in the Persian Gulf and Iran would have changed fundamentally, and the power dynamics for the region would also have changed fundamentally in favor of Iran?
I mean, vis-a-vis perhaps the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, yeah. Saudi Arabia is a different story. Saudi Arabia has strategic depth. It also has a Red Sea coast. So, and Saudi Arabia also stepped up to the plate diplomatically. Let's be candid. Iran owes Saudi Arabia at this point for not hitting back hard when Iranian drones and missiles from Iraq, from allied Shia militias, hit Saudi Arabia. It did not respond ferociously. It has taken the diplomatic initiative and so on. So I think that, definitely Saudi and Iran moved to more parity in terms of their relations. But Iran has shown that it can cut off the Persian Gulf, and it will. And now that this proof of concept has been established that Iran can do this, can close the Strait of Hormuz with a few drones and threats of firing missiles, that puts the other countries of the Persian Gulf littoral, i.e. those 4 smaller emirates, it puts them in a tough position and tough situation.
Before the war, we were hearing all this big talk from Israel saying that now, they would be the hegemon in the region. They would be the most powerful country. They were even talking in terms of being a superpower. What happens to Israel once this conflict ends on the terms that we're talking about?
It will continue to hammer away at mostly defenseless people in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon, and it will be very aggressive there. But I think it will have to think twice again before hitting Iran, because, man, this has been hurtful for Israel's reputation. Man, has this damaged the U.S. Reputation for having this fierce military. And man, has this war strengthened these regional powers like Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like never before, and even Turkey, which was already a kind of regional hegemon. And already you see Israel talking beyond Iran, talking about Turkey and how it wants to cut Turkey down to size. They don't dare say anything about nuclear-armed Pakistan, but there is that in the background as well. There's a lot of anger at Turkey and Pakistan for intervening, using their influence in Washington to get Trump to make decisions that were counter to Israeli interests.
But Netanyahu's relationship with Trump is also under strain now.
I'm not so sure about that. That could be a little bit of play acting. I mean, Netanyahu's allies in Washington give Trump and his supporters a lot of money, and Trump is tied by marriage to that same clique of pro-Israel activists and operatives in Washington. Jared Kushner is part of that machinery. His favorite child, Ivanka Trump, is married to Jared Kushner. There is a symbiotic relationship there that goes beyond just political interests. Yes, I think that there is strain between Netanyahu and Trump, but that doesn't extend to Trump and Israel, which, perhaps it's time for Netanyahu to go and for some other Israeli leader who will probably be just as aggressive as Netanyahu to take the plate, because he won't have the reputational baggage.
And Netanyahu might end up in prison. That's what we hear.
I mean, that's been his struggle. His struggle this whole time is to stay in power so that he can stave off the judges and the prosecutors and so on. This has been his whole modus operandi at this point, is to change the laws, change the political equation, make partners with people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, these extremists that have been against him his whole career, because he needs to stay in power, because his coalition keeps getting smaller and smaller, and he has to empower these fanatics, essentially, to stay in power, and that has created all of the problems that we see now.
And finally, in terms of the post-war scenario and the role of the U.S. in the region, do you see that footprint decreasing to or diminishing to some extent?
I mean, it will have to, because it'll just be so expensive to rebuild some of these bases, for one thing. According to the Washington Post and other news outlets, more than 30 U.S. bases in the region were really badly damaged by the Iranian strikes. This is all emerging now. But to another extent, those bases and that footprint have proven to be more of a strategic liability than an asset. It's like, guess what? When you have these open bases out in the middle of the desert, you're a target. And Iran proved that. And so I think a lot of countries are going to think twice about allowing the U.S. to set up bases on their territory, especially since the U.S. rushed its munitions and its defensive weaponry to Israel instead of staying put and defending the countries that were hosting its bases.
Also, some good discussion on India's NewsX about Iran and the negotiations, as well as about what Israel's thinking is these days, and the rollback of democratic progress in Turkey with the court's decision to depose Özgür Özel as the leader of the opposition political party, the CHP, or the People's Republican Party.
Are we seeing widening gaps now between the US and Iran over the very foundations of any possible agreement?
You know, this is the dysfunction of the Iran-US relationship and the incompetence of the negotiating teams. They shouldn't be negotiating these things in public. If viewers recall, or if they were following closely this weekend, this whole talk of a negotiation began with a post that Donald Trump issued saying that we're very close to a deal. It was a very serious post in contrast to some of his other posts. And he basically let the cat out of the bag, essentially saying we're close to a deal. It was very serious in its language and so on, and everyone took it seriously. And then you had all these people in Trump's base, the pro-Israel base, part of his political supporters. They came out on social media, they came out on the TV channels, and they started hammering away at Donald Trump, saying this is a betrayal. Why is he making this deal? This deal looks like the one that Barack Obama made. And then you saw Donald Trump kind of backtracking a little bit, posting some more nasty, ugly tweets about Iran and so on. And then you see the Trump administration kind of walking back some of the claims that he himself had made in the original post. And then so you see the Iranians doing the same thing. They're saying, if you're going to negotiate like that, we're going to negotiate like that. It's a little juvenile. This is why it's best, for example, when you are having a negotiation with an adversary, to keep everything secret and hush-hush. Don't make early announcements. And then until you have a deal, there is no deal. So you don't need to say that, we're on the verge of a deal. This was the mistake. This is the amateurish nature of the Trump administration. This is him opening his big mouth again. And the consequences of that is that a deal that seemed to be moving closer and closer now appears to be moving farther and farther. Now, I will say this. Neither the U.S. nor Iran want to return back to war, and they realize that that's the only alternative. So I think that there is a real big incentive for both those countries to come to some kind of deal.
Of course, and like you mentioned, the contradiction between we're close to a deal and we're nowhere near. Iran suggests that despite diplomatic engagement going on, they believe a deal is still far away, whereas Trump and Rubio been speaking to reporters and said they are on the edge of a deal. Is this cautious messaging aimed at managing domestic expectations inside Iran, or does it reflect deep unresolved disagreements behind closed doors? Because Iran is saying that current negotiations are focused on ending the war and not on its nuclear program.
Well, my understanding, and this is all based on leaks, which are really inappropriate, is that there will be a 30 or 60 day window where they will basically end the war, so to speak, and remove the blockade from the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians will open it up to some traffic. The Americans will stop blocking Iranian ships from leaving. And in return, there would be some kind of financial relief for the Iranians, whether in the form of unfreezing of billions of dollars of frozen Iranian assets, or some sanctions relief, or less likely but possible, some kind of toll imposed on the Strait of Hormuz, some kind of money-making mechanism. Because Iran wants some compensation for the damage that it suffered, and it demands that as any condition for any talks. And then during that 30 or 60 day period,
the United States and Iran, once there is a little bit of goodwill and trust and understanding, begin or conclude discussions on the broader issue of Iran's nuclear program. And that is not a bad framework for a deal. The problem is that in those 30 to 60 days, there can be a lot of things that happen. There can be a lot of spoilers. Israel in particular has apparently asked its surrogates to try to sabotage this deal. They're out there on social media and on the Sunday talk shows, just basically criticizing Trump for making any kind of deal with Iran, calling him a traitor, calling him every other name in the book. So there's a lot of pressure on both sides, and this is why it's a mistake to negotiate in public.
Could these mixed signals from Tehran and Washington indicate that diplomacy is entering a more fragile and unpredictable phase rather than moving towards a breakthrough?
Look, as smarter people than me have pointed out, if there was any military solution to the U.S. dilemma, they would have done it. They would have tried it. And at this point, I am sure that his military advisors are saying what military experts that I talk to and listen to are saying, and that there is no military solution to the dilemma of opening up the Strait of Hormuz, that this is such a narrow choke point, and the geography makes it such that it's absolutely impossible to open this by force. It has to be a political decision. And so Trump is in a bind. He can't use military means to open the Strait of Hormuz. Military means might make matters worse, because then Iran would respond by attacking the energy infrastructure in the Gulf, further raising gas prices, further destroying the global economy. That's not what he wants, especially ahead of midterm elections for his party that could really put him in trouble. So it's the military is the only solution, is not really a solution. Military is the alternative to diplomacy. That's a reality, but the military path just won't work in this particular case. Americans know that. I mean, they could face renewed calls for accountability at the UN, but the United States will veto any serious action with teeth. It has made a mockery of international law, according to most legal experts. The Israeli government doesn't really seem to care much about international law, except when it applies to other countries. So that, for example, you mentioned in an earlier report about Lebanon and Hezbollah and Israel demanding that the Lebanese government abide by commitments it signed on to disarm Hezbollah. But when it comes to Israel abiding by international law, international norms, Israel disregards those, and it has the U.S. to protect it.
The Turkish court's decision to annul the 2023 CHP Congress and remove Özgür has sparked outrage among opposition supporters. Is this...
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a backsliding on democracy. It's not viewed as a legitimate move. Most people in Turkey realize that the judiciary has been made hopelessly corrupt and under the sway of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's ruling party, the Justice and Development Party, known by the acronyms AKP. And this removal of Özgür Özel from the head of the CHP is viewed in line with moves by Erdogan to get rid of any rising political talent. Just a couple years ago, the government here arrested the popular and talented mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, and then he was basically replaced as the leading firebrand of the party by Özgür Özel. He turned out in some ways to be even better than Ekrem İmamoğlu. I think that Erdogan got more than he bargained for. And so in this particular case, he took no chances. He got rid of Özgür Özel and then installed Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. I know him. He's not a bad guy, but he's basically not a good politician. He's not a good speaker. He's really old and doddering, and installed him as his preferred opposition, which if you think about it, it's like, look, I don't want to be a complete non-democrat. I don't want to destroy the opposition party. I just want to make the opposition party so weak and incompetent that it can't really take me on.
This is a move right out of the playbook of people like Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are the kinds of moves that these autocrats take to keep control, and I'm sure it happens in other countries as well. And so this is a real bad step for Turkish democracy.
Hey, thank you so much for listening in. Again, I'm Borzu of the Badlands podcast and newsletter. I'm on Substack at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you again for watching or listening.